Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Darkvale. Today we're covering 9 of the most disturbing true trucker encounter stories ever submitted to this channel. Please subscribe, turn the bell on, because this channel is about slow-burning authentic horror over cheap jump scares. Now, let's get into it. Dale Kessler had been driving solo for exactly 11 months when the pickup in El Paso ran 3 hours late and put him on I-10 west of Van Horn at 20 to 4 in the morning, with 400 more miles to burn and a receiver who opened at 8 sharp. He'd had 2 gas station coffees since midnight, the kind that go cold and bitter in the cup holder before you're even halfway done, and he was doing the math truckers do in the dark. Miles left over, hours left over, how much of that 8 a.m. window he could still make if he didn't stop again. The AC was rattling on the passenger side vent the way it always did over 65, and the desert outside was doing what it does at that hour, which is nothing. Flat black on both sides, a highway that doesn't so much as curve for 40 miles, and the kind of quiet that makes a man start talking to himself just to hear a voice. The CB was on channel 19 out of habit more than need. Nobody talks much out that far. You're past the last way station, past the last real traffic, and most of what you get is dead air. So when it started hissing, on and off, a soft rush of static that came up and dropped away like somebody riding a volume knob, he figured the antenna connection had finally worked itself loose, same as it had twice before on this truck. He reached over and thumped the radio housing with 2 knuckles, the way you do, and the hiss cut out for a second, and then came right back, patient about it, like it wasn't actually broken at all. That was when he looked left and saw the light holding just off his mirror. It wasn't headlights. He knew headlights, knew taillights, knew the shape a plane makes coming down toward El Paso International with its landing lights stacked and blinking. This was one light, soft-edged, more the color of a low lamp through a curtain than anything with a bulb in it, and it was sitting maybe 40 yards off his door at the exact height of his cab, holding there like it was pinned to the mirror bracket. No wings he could make out, no blink pattern, no strobe. None of the running lights an aircraft is required to carry. Just there, steady, keeping pace, with a fully loaded rig, doing 71 miles an hour on cruise control. He told himself it was a plane too far out to judge right, some private thing running dark out of Kent or Del City, and that the distance was playing games with his eyes, the way distance does at that hour when your body thinks it should be asleep. He reached for the CB again and keyed it toward channel 17, the one he and a driver named Gus Renfro used when they were both running this stretch, because Gus had left the yard 40 minutes ahead of him and ought to still be somewhere out past Kent. "Gus, you got your ears on," he said, and let go of the key, and got the hiss back, instead of Gus's voice, that same static rising and falling like it was breathing. He tried again, said Gus's handle, said it was Dale, said come back, and got nothing but that soft tide of noise. No click, no break, nothing that told him another human being was anywhere near that radio. He eased off in his lane, just to see, drifting the truck a foot or two toward the shoulder line, and the light matched him without a beat of delay, holding the same 40 yards, the same height, like it was tied to his mirror with fishing line. He pulled back the other way, further than he needed to, hard enough that the trailer complained through the fifth wheel, and the light came with him again, smooth, no lag, no overshoot and correction, the way even a good pilot flying formation would show. A plane banks. A drone jerks and hunts to find its line again. This didn't do either. It just was where he was, a beat before he even finished the move, like it already knew where the truck was going, before his hands did. That was the point where the word plane stopped doing any work for him, and he didn't have another word to put in its place, so he just watched it instead, hands sweating a little on the wheel, telling himself it was heat lightning reflecting off the trailer, telling himself it was his own running lights bouncing off something in the dark, telling himself half a dozen ordinary things in a row, the way a man does when the ordinary things have already stopped fitting. And then, without speeding up or falling back, the light drifted forward past his door, out ahead of the hood, dipped low toward the median grass, and wasn't there anymore. Not fading, not shrinking into the distance the way a plane does. Just gone, in the time it takes to blink, and the CB hiss dropped out with it, and the radio went back to the flat, empty silence it should have had the whole time. He didn't call it in. He'd already half decided that before the light was even gone, somewhere in the back of his head where the real decisions get made before you notice you've made them. Dispatch flags anything strange as a fatigue incident, and a fatigue incident means a drug screen and a sit-down, and your hours of service log gets pulled apart, line by line, looking for the violation that made you see things. He was 11 months in. He wasn't giving anybody a reason to make an example out of him. What he thought about instead, 4 miles down the road, with his hands still not quite steady on the wheel, was his cousin Denny Ochoa, who'd driven this same lane of I-10 for 6 years, before he went off the road, just past mile marker 140 on a clear night in August, 2 summers back. The report said fatigue. Denny, who logged his hours cleaner than any driver Dale had ever ridden with, who used to lecture 19-year-old Dale about pulling over the second his eyes got heavy, instead of pushing for one more exit. Dale had never said it out loud to anybody, but he'd never bought the fatigue finding, not really. Not from a man that careful. He hadn't thought about Denny in months. He thought about him now for the rest of the drive into Van Horn. He pulled off for fuel at the truck stop on the west end of town, the one with the cracked concrete apron and the coffee machine that's always half out of creamer. And while he was standing at the pump, another driver, older, gray in his beard, nodded at him, the way drivers do, and said something about the wind picking up out past the Lobo turnoff. Dale, still rattled enough that his mouth got ahead of him, said something about his radio acting up right around there, static with nothing on it. The older man didn't laugh it off the way Dale half expected. He just got quiet for a second, screwed his gas cap back on, and said that Stretch does that to a few radios, always has, and that most guys don't talk about it much because there's no percentage in it. Then he climbed up into his cab and pulled out without saying anything else, and Dale stood there by the pump a while longer than he needed to, understanding that he'd just found out this wasn't only his. 2 days later, back at the yard outside San Antonio, his dispatcher Renee called him into the trailer that served as an office and pulled his log up on the screen without much preamble. She wasn't accusing him of anything, she said, but the ELD data had a gap in it she needed him to explain for the file. About 4 minutes, right around mile marker 138 on I-10, where the GPS pings showed the truck sitting dead still while the engine hours kept climbing, like he'd parked in the middle of the interstate with the motor running, and then picked right back up to speed like nothing happened. Dale sat there with his hands in his lap and told her the antenna must have thrown the unit off, dropped the connection for a minute, and she wrote that down, not fully satisfied, and let it go, because the numbers on either side of the gap matched up fine, and there was no accident report to chase. But she looked at him a second longer than the explanation called for, and he understood then that whatever had happened out there hadn't just happened in his head. It had happened to the truck's own clock, too. That night, he sat in his apartment with his laptop and pulled the footage off the dashcam's SD card. The forward-facing unit the company had bolted above his windshield 8 months back, after some lawsuit made every carrier in the state start covering itself. He scrubbed to 3:41 a.m. and watched the road unspool in grainy night vision, the white lines ticking by, the dash glow steady, and nothing beside the truck at all. No light, no shape, no flare of anything the lens should have caught, if it was really sitting 40 yards off his door the whole time. He almost closed the laptop right there, halfway convinced he'd talked himself into something out of coffee and bad sleep. Then he noticed the audio waveform running along the bottom of the player, and where the timestamp lined up with what he remembered, there was a low, soft ridge of sound rising and falling in the track. The same hiss, recorded clean as anything, with no picture to go with it at all. He played it 4 times. It was there every time, real as the pavement noise around it, and the road beside him in the picture stayed perfectly, completely empty, the whole way through. He couldn't sleep after that, so he did what he swore he wasn't going to do, which was go looking for it. Not on any official channel. He wasn't fool enough to post his own name to a company forum. But on one of the driver boards, a lot of guys used to swap load info and gripe about brokers. A place called Long Haul Nation, where half the users went by handles instead of real names. He searched mile marker, hiss, light, radio, and got back 3 threads he hadn't expected, going back almost 6 years, describing the same stretch, the same hour give or take 20 minutes, always in summer, always a solo driver running behind on a hot load. Different trucks, different companies. One woman driving reefer out of Georgia, who wrote it up almost word for word, the way Dale would have written it himself. A light off her mirror, the radio doing that same slow hiss, the thing peeling off low over the median and gone. He read every reply on every thread that night, and none of them had a real answer. Just other drivers saying they'd heard the same, or seen the same, and didn't much want to talk about it either. One thread stopped him cold. A driver going by Panhandle Rick had posted the same account, almost casual about it, 2 years back. And under it, 11 months later, a short comment from an account with no other posts, saying it was Rick's daughter, that nobody in the family had heard from him since a run through West Texas that spring, that if anyone here knew anything, to please reach out. No other replies. No update after that. Dale sat with that for a long while, the cursor blinking over a blank reply box he never filled in. And what stuck with him wasn't fear exactly, or not only fear. It was the plain, cold thought that whatever this was, the drivers who'd kept their hands on the wheel and just kept driving were the ones still around to write about it. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't pulled over to look closer, hadn't slowed down to try to get a better angle on it. He'd just driven through it, same as always, foot steady on the pedal, and he was starting to think that was the only thing that had ever mattered. After that, he started routing himself off I-10 through that stretch, whenever a load gave him the choice, dropping down to the frontage road or swinging a longer way around through Kent, even when it cost him 20 extra minutes. And he never told Renee why, just let her think he liked the truck stop on the alternate route better. It worked for a while. 4 months went by clean. Then a rush load out of Odessa put him back on I-10 westbound with no other option the dispatcher would sign off on. A temperature-sensitive haul that couldn't afford the detour, and he found himself back on that same flat black highway at 20 to 4 in the morning, in the middle of July, the heat still coming up off the asphalt, in waves he could feel through the floor of the cab. He told himself it would be fine. He told himself a lot of things get told once and then again, and stop meaning anything by the 3rd time. And right around mile marker 138, the CB started hissing. He didn't reach for the radio this time. He kept both hands on the wheel and watched it happen in his mirror before he even turned his head. The light rising up off the desert floor to his left, holding position, matching his speed to the mile an hour, same as before, patient, in a way that didn't feel hostile so much as simply certain of itself. He didn't try to outrun it. He didn't try to raise anybody on the radio. He just drove, watching it out of the corner of his eye, his pulse loud enough in his ears that he could hear it over the engine. It held there for almost a mile, same as the first time. And then it did the thing it had done before, drifted forward past the hood, dipped low toward the median. Except this time, the instant it broke away, his headlights swept up and caught something in his own lane a quarter-mile ahead. A stalled pickup, dark, no hazards on, sitting square across the right lane where somebody had blown a tire and coasted to a dead stop without so much as a taillight working, right where a man doing 71, with his eyes half on the road and half on a light in his mirror, would have driven straight into the back of it without a half-second of warning. His body reacted before his mind caught up to what it was reacting to. Foot already easing off, hands already easing the wheel left into the open lane, the trailer swaying wide and steady around the stalled truck with maybe 2 car lengths to spare, gravel spraying off the shoulder as his outside tires touched dirt for a second before he pulled it back straight. He came to a stop 300 yards past it, hazards blinking, hands shaking hard enough on the wheel that he had to grip it to make them stop, and sat there a long minute in the dark with his engine idling before he picked up his phone and called it in to the highway patrol as a disabled vehicle. No names, no story, just a location and a description, because whatever else he wasn't going to say out loud, he wasn't going to let the next truck through find that pickup the hard way. He never did report the light. He never told Renee, never told anybody at the company, never posted his own account to Long Haul Nation, the way he'd read so many others do. But he stopped thinking of that mile marker the way he had those first months, as a thing to be afraid of, and routed around at any cost. Now, on the nights a load puts him back on that stretch and he can't avoid it, he still feels his shoulders tighten up around mile 136, still watches his mirror without meaning to, and if the hiss comes up out of that dead channel, and the light comes with it, he doesn't reach for the CB anymore, and he doesn't try to talk himself out of what he's seeing. He just keeps both hands on the wheel, holds his lane, and says something under his breath that isn't quite a prayer and isn't quite thanks, but sits somewhere close to both, until it peels off low over the median, same as always, and leaves him alone with the road, the dash glow, and a stretch of empty video with a hiss running under it that nobody at the company has ever been able to explain. Roy Kessler had been driving team routes for 21 years, and in that time he had seen every kind of thing a two-lane highway could throw at a man at midnight. Deer that stood in the headlights like they'd made peace with dying. Fog so thick you drove by the sound of your own tires. A moose once, standing dead center on M28, that cost the company 11 grand, and nearly cost Roy his spine. None of that prepared him for what happened 40 minutes past Seney, on US 2, the night the trees started flashing. His partner, Danny Ostrander, was asleep in the back, curled toward the wall, the way he always slept, like he was bracing for the truck to tip. They'd been teamed for 8 months. Danny was 28, quiet, good with logs, the kind of kid who never once complained about pulling the graveyard leg. Roy liked driving next to a sleeping partner. It made the road feel private. The first thing Roy noticed was the light on the shoulder pines, a slow wash of orange-white that came and went, come and gone, like somebody flicking a lighter behind a curtain of branches. His first thought was practical, the way it always is for a man who spent 2 decades reading a highway. Hazards. Somebody's pulled off and popped their hazards, and the trees are catching the strobe. He eased off the pedal, watching for a shape on the shoulder, a car, a rig, anything with 4 wheels and a busted alternator. There was nothing there. The light kept moving, and it was moving through the tops of the trees, not against them. That was the detail that snagged in Roy's chest and wouldn't let go. It wasn't bouncing off trunks the way a hazard light would. It was gliding above the canopy, dipping and rising with the tree line, like something was actually up there, riding the tops of 80-foot pines, the way a hand trails along a fence. He slowed the truck to 40, then 30, and he found himself doing math he didn't have the numbers for. It was pacing them, not passing, not falling behind. Whatever it was holding station off the driver's side at the exact speed of an 18-wheeler doing 30 in a 35, and it had been doing that, Roy realized with a cold little drop in his stomach, since before he'd even consciously clocked it. He reached back, without taking his eyes off the glass, and knocked twice on the sleeper wall. Danny, wake up. Danny came up groggy, the way anybody does at that hour. And by the time he'd gotten himself upright and blinked toward the windshield, he caught only the tail end of it, a smear of light sliding off through the last of the tree line on Roy's side, gone before Danny's eyes had even finished adjusting. "What?" Danny said. "What am I looking at?" "You didn't see it." "I saw something. A light. What was it?" Roy didn't answer right away, because he genuinely didn't have an answer. And that not having was its own kind of strange. He wasn't scared. Not yet. Not in the gut-punch way fear usually announced itself. He was confused in a way he hadn't been since he was a much younger man. the specific confusion of watching something that refused to sort itself into any drawer his brain owned. That was when the CB went dead. Not staticky dead, not the hiss of a channel with nobody on it. Dead dead. The kind of silence that has a texture to it, like the air had been vacuum sealed. Roy had run Channel 19 on this stretch for 2 decades, and there was always something, a trucker griping about a scale house, somebody's wife on the phone patch. Garbage, but something. He reached over and thumbed it, keyed it. Nothing came back but a flat nothing, that wasn't even proper static. And that was the second time that night the world declined to behave the way Roy expected it to, and it was the second time in about 90 seconds, and he felt something in his chest tighten that had nothing to do with the light and everything to do with the radio. Then it crossed the road. It came off the tree line on Danny's side now. Low, maybe 60 feet up, no more than that. Moving unhurried, almost lazy, the way a piece of paper drifts on a breeze, rather than the way anything with an engine moves. There was no sound. That was the thing Roy kept coming back to for days afterward, lying in his own bed in Escanaba trying to sleep. A logging truck at 60 feet makes a sound you feel in your fillings. A plane, even a quiet one, has a hum you can pick out of 100 night noises. This had nothing. It crossed directly over the cab, close enough that both men instinctively ducked, and there wasn't so much as a whisper of displaced air. Danny didn't say a single word for the next 11 miles. Roy knew it was 11, because he watched the odometer, the way you watch something when you don't know what else to do with your eyes. When Danny finally spoke, it wasn't about the light. It was a flat, quiet request that didn't invite negotiation. I need off this route. Whatever run this is, put in for something else. I'll take a pay cut. Roy laughed, a short surprised sound, because Danny wasn't a dramatic kid, wasn't prone to big asks, and the flatness of it was somehow worse than if he'd been shaking. You didn't even see the thing cross the road. You saw a smear. I saw enough, Danny said, and wouldn't add to it, not that night, not the next morning, when they dropped the load in Ironwood, not for 3 more weeks, no matter how many times Roy brought it up over gas station coffee. The next morning, in the yard light at the terminal, Roy found the mark on the hood. A thin, curved discoloration in the clear coat, maybe 8 inches long, the kind of thing that looks at first like a bird had grazed it, or a branch had whipped across during a low overpass. Except it wasn't a scratch. There was no gouge, no lifted paint. It was a scorch, a faint, burn-brown crescent baked into the clear coat itself, like a hot iron laid against it for half a second and lifted away clean. He ran his thumb over it. Smooth, warm to the touch, even though the truck had been sitting in a cold yard all night. Though Roy told himself later, that part might have been his own hand shaking, and not the metal at all. He took it to the body shop in town, a place he'd used for a dozen years, and the guy who ran it, a heavy-set man named Pruitt, who'd fixed dents on half the trucks in the county, looked at the mark for a long time without saying anything. Then he did something Roy hadn't expected. He didn't ask what happened. Most guys ask what happened. Pruitt just wiped his hands on a rag and said he'd need to order a panel because buffing wouldn't touch it. The discoloration went into the clear coat itself, not on top of it. When Roy pushed, half joking, asked if Pruitt had ever seen anything like it, the man's face did something small and careful, a kind of shuddering, and he said no, never, and changed the subject to the cost of the panel. Roy might have let the whole thing go, chalked it up to sleep deprivation and a trick of low cloud reflecting some ground light he couldn't place. Except that a week later, sitting in the driver's lounge at the terminal, with nothing to do but drink bad coffee and wait on a delayed load, he made an offhand comment to Wexler, a driver who'd been running that same corridor for going on 30 years. Roy didn't even frame it as a sighting. He just said something about weird lights out past Senny, half a joke, testing the water. Wexler didn't laugh. Wexler set his coffee down slow and asked Roy exactly where on the route it happened, exactly what time. And when Roy told him, the old man nodded, like he was checking something off a list he'd been keeping his whole career. He told Roy that Stretch had a name among the old-timers. Not an official name, just something the long-haul guys who'd run it for decades called it between themselves, and that Roy was maybe the 9th or 10th driver Wexler had personally heard describe some version of that light. In the 20 years Wexler had been running teams through there. That was the moment the night stopped being a strange thing that happened to Roy specifically, and became something else. Something with a history longer than his own tenure at the company, and the size of that realization sat in his stomach like a stone for the rest of the shift. Wexler mentioned, almost as an aside, a name: Curtis Hale, a team driver who'd gone missing off that same stretch 15 years back, driving solo that night because his partner had called in sick. His truck had been found idling on the shoulder near mile marker 60-something, driver's door open, headlights on, no sign of Hale anywhere, no struggle, nothing, like he'd stepped out to check a noise and simply not come back. The case had never closed. The company had settled quietly with his family, and the story had mostly died out with the drivers who'd known him, except that it apparently hadn't died at all. It had just gone underground, passed mouth to mouth in break rooms and truck stops, the way these things do when nobody wants to say the words out loud on a recorded line. Roy started asking around more directly after that, and it was around this time that he noticed the company's response to his questions had a strange, over-smooth quality to it, the kind of calm that doesn't come naturally to dispatchers who are usually harried and short with drivers over far smaller things. When he asked his terminal manager, a woman named Corrine who'd never once in 4 years had time for idle chat, whether there'd ever been reports of aircraft or lights along that Sani stretch, she didn't ask him why he wanted to know. She just said she'd look into it, and 2 days later, without any conversation about it at all, Roy and Danny were both reassigned to a completely different corridor, a run down through Wisconsin that neither of them had bid on or requested, with a note in the system attributing it to route optimization. It was the speed of it that got under Roy's skin. Paperwork at that company moved like cold molasses for everything else. Home time requests, equipment repairs, per diem disputes. This had gone through in 48 hours. He had an old Army buddy, a man named Petrosky, who'd spent a career in supply logistics and had a habit, born of boredom in his retirement, of filing Freedom of Information requests on anything that caught his curiosity. Roy called him more out of frustration than real hope, gave him the stretch of highway and the rough date range going back as far as Wexler's memory reached. It took Petrosky the better part of 2 months, and what he came back with wasn't a smoking gun so much as a pattern of small, dry, bureaucratic nothings that added up to something Roy couldn't unsee once he saw it. A series of temporary flight restriction notices, filed and lifted, over a patch of airspace above that exact stretch of forest, going back at least 11 years, always at night, always brief, always attributed in the paperwork to nothing more specific than routine testing. Roy sat with that phrase for a long time. Routine testing. It was the kind of phrase built to answer a question without actually answering it, and the more he turned it over, the more it felt less like an explanation and more like a door somebody had deliberately left ajar, just far enough to make you think you'd been let in. It was around then that Danny finally talked. 6 weeks after the Wisconsin reassignment, the two of them sharing a diner booth outside Rhinelander at 2 in the morning, because neither of them could sleep before a run anymore. Danny told him this wasn't the first team he'd been on where something like that had happened. 2 years earlier, running a different corridor with an older driver named Simmons, Danny had watched Simmons see something similar, closer, longer, and watched what it did to the man afterward. Simmons had started missing shifts, then missing days, then had simply stopped showing up at all, and when Danny finally tracked down a mutual contact to ask, the answer he got was that Simmons had checked himself into a facility downstate and asked his own family not to visit. Danny had said nothing to the company at the time because he was young and needed the job, and had convinced himself that silence was the safer bet. And he told Roy now, flatly, without drama, that he still believed that silence was still the safer bet, and that the only reason he was breaking it at all was that he trusted Roy not to do anything stupid with the information. Roy did something stupid with the information anyway. He pulled the FOIA documents Petrosky had sent him up against a county plat map, and cross-referencing the described restricted airspace boundary against actual terrain, he found that it didn't sit over open forest at all. Not exactly. It sat over a stretch of land that included an old fire access road, one that hadn't shown up on any current highway atlas, running 2.5 miles north off US 2 into land the county record still listed under an inactive mining claim from the 1950s, a claim nobody had touched in 70 years, and that, according to the tax rolls, was somehow still being quietly paid on by an LLC, registered in Delaware, with no public officers listed. He didn't tell Danny what he planned to do. He told himself that was for Danny's protection, though later he'd admit to himself it was at least half, because he suspected Danny would have talked him out of it. On his next home stretch, on a night off, Roy drove his own pickup back out to that same section of US 2, alone, and parked on the shoulder near where the fire road cut in, and waited with the engine off and the CB on, running the same channel 19 out of habit more than hope. For nearly 2 hours, nothing happened at all, and Roy had begun to feel something close to foolish, sitting alone on a dark road at his age, chasing a light like a kid who'd stayed up too late believing in something. Then the radio went dead the same way it had that first night, that same total, textured silence, and the trees to the north, up along where the fire road would have run, lit with that same slow orange-white wash. This time it didn't stay in the canopy. It came down. Roy would never be able to describe afterward exactly what he saw in those next few seconds, because what happened wasn't really about the light at all. Headlights came up the fire road fast, 2 sets, no sirens, no markings that he could make out in the dark, and by the time they reached the highway, a truck was already blocking the mouth of the road, and 2 men in plain dark jackets were walking toward his pickup with the unhurried, practiced calm of men who had clearly done this exact thing before. They didn't threaten him. They didn't ask for identification. One of them simply tapped his window, and when Roy rolled it down, the man told him, in a voice with no particular urgency in it at all, that this was private land and he needed to move along, and that was the whole conversation, start to finish, maybe 40 seconds, and then they stood there in his headlights and watched him do a 3-point turn on the narrow shoulder and drive away. He went back to that spot twice more in daylight over the following month, and both times found nothing. No gate, no fence, no sign that a fire road had ever existed there at all. The mouth of it grown over with brush so thick and settled it looked undisturbed for years, not weeks. Petrosky's follow-up requests came back denied, citing national security exemptions that hadn't been invoked on the earlier, more innocuous filings. The dashcam footage from Roy's pickup, which he was certain he'd saved that same night to a laptop at home, wasn't on the laptop when he went looking for it 2 days later, and he spent an ugly, sleepless week, wondering if he'd simply failed to save it, or forgotten, or if he was starting to become the kind of man who couldn't trust his own memory of his own actions, which frightened him in a way the light itself never quite had. 6 months after that, the company offered Roy an early retirement package that was, by any honest measure, generous well past what his tenure or his union contract obligated them to give. Nobody mentioned the incident. Nobody needed to. Corrine handled the paperwork herself, in person, with a warmth she'd never once shown him in 4 years of curt radio traffic, and Roy signed it because he had a wife and a mortgage, and had, somewhere in that long, strange year, stopped believing that pushing further would get him anything but more of the same soft, immovable wall he'd already been running into. Danny stayed on, took a different partner, and still runs teams out of that same terminal, though he's never again bid on anything that touches US 2 through the Upper Peninsula. And when younger drivers ask him why, he tells them it's a personal thing and leaves it there, the same way you'd expect a man to leave it who has learned, the hard way, exactly how much a job is worth and exactly how much it isn't. Roy still keeps the estimate Pruitt's shop wrote up for that hood panel, the one he never actually had replaced, because somewhere in the chaos of those months, he simply stopped caring about how the truck looked. 2 years after his retirement, scrolling late at night through a trucker forum out of habit more than purpose, he came across a photo posted by a driver out of Green Bay, a hood shot, asking if anyone recognized a strange discoloration in the clear coat that his body shop couldn't explain. A thin, curved burn mark. No gouge, no lifted paint, smooth to the touch. The driver mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd picked it up somewhere on a night run through the Upper Peninsula, though he couldn't say exactly where, because the whole stretch of highway that night, he wrote, had felt exactly the same both directions, mile after mile, like the road itself had folded back on him twice, before he'd noticed he was driving in a straight line the whole time. Roy read that post 4 times before he closed the laptop, and he never did write back. Dale Kessler had been hauling oversized loads for 12 years, and in that time he'd learned that Wyoming wind was its own kind of animal. Not weather exactly, more like something alive that lived in the gap between the Snowy Range and the Sierra Madres, and spent its whole existence trying to shove things sideways. He was 3 miles east of Rawlins on I-80, 65 feet of turbine blade riding behind him on a specialized trailer, escort pilot cars front and back, permits stacked on the seat beside him, and a storm supposed to roll through by 9 that would shut the whole corridor down to nothing. He needed to get this blade to the Antelope Ridge site before that happened, or he'd be sitting roadside for 2 days, waiting on YDOT to lift a high wind restriction, and the site coordinator had already texted him twice asking where he was. That's when he saw the lights. 3 of them, low against the horizon, sitting dead over the turbine field he was delivering to. His first read was construction lighting, somebody running late setting rebar, or checking a foundation pour before the freeze locked the ground solid. He'd seen crews do stranger things under deadline pressure. But something about the color bothered him before his brain caught up to why. They weren't the sodium orange of work lights, or the white flicker of a generator-fed rig. They were a flat, steady white blue, holding in a perfect triangle, like someone had hung 3 marbles on invisible wire. He keyed his CB. "Renee, you seeing that out past the turbines? 2 o'clock, low." A pause. Then her voice, flatter than usual. "Yeah, I got it. 3rd time I've seen something like that out here, Dale. Not gonna lie to you." That stopped him for a second. Not because she saw them too. He'd expected that. Wanted the confirmation. But because she'd said 3rd time. He'd run this same corridor with Renee, twice before this month. Both nights. Both times delivering to this exact site. And she'd never said a word about lights until tonight. 3rd time meaning what, he said. Like this. Tonight. Or, meaning I've had this happen the last 2 nights running out here, and didn't say anything because I figured I was imagining it. I wasn't going to be the escort driver who calls it in as a UFO. The wind picked that moment to slam broadside into his trailer, 65 feet of fiberglass acting like a sail, and he felt the whole rig lean and fight him, the wheel going heavy and alive in his hands the way it did when a gust topped 50. He was hauling nearly 100,000 pounds combined, and for 2 full seconds, he wasn't thinking about lights at all. He was thinking about the ditch. He corrected, felt the tires bite back in, breathed. When he glanced up again, the lights hadn't so much as trembled, hadn't drifted an inch in the gust that had just tried to put him in a snow fence. That was the part that snagged in his chest and wouldn't let go. Not fear yet, just a kind of disbelief. Because everything else out here answered to that wind. The blade on his own trailer was answering to it right now. Whatever those 3 lights were, they weren't. He pulled his site map up on the dash tablet, cross-referencing pad numbers against his delivery paperwork out of habit more than anything, and when he laid the compass bearing of those lights against the grid, they sat almost exactly over pad 14. He knew pad 14. He'd hauled 2 blades out to it back in October, before the whole section got flagged, and construction there just stopped. No explanation on his end, beyond a line in the delivery notes that said hold for easement review. There was no tower up on 14, no crane, no crew, no generator, nothing to hang a light on or bounce one off of. Just a poured foundation sitting alone in 6 inches of snow. "Dale, you want a picture of this, or what?" Renee said over the radio, and he realized, without deciding to, that his hand had already drifted toward the switch for his high beams, some old instinct telling him to throw light at the thing and see what it was made of. He hit them. The lights went out. All 3, at once, the instant his beams swept that stretch of horizon. "They're gone," he said. "They didn't just go out," Renee said, and there was something tighter in her voice now. "They slid together first, toward the ridge. Then they cut out. You didn't see that?" He hadn't. He'd seen 3 lights on, then nothing. No motion in between. Like someone had thrown a breaker. She was insisting she'd watched them slide sideways a full second before they died, and the 2 of them sat there on open radio, arguing gently about the order of something that had taken maybe 2 seconds total, each one certain of a different sequence for the same event. "Just take the picture," he said, mostly to end the disagreement, and heard her phone shutter click over the CB's background hiss. The photo, when she held her phone up at the next fuel stop in Sinclair so he could see it, showed nothing. Black sky, a smear of horizon glow from the site's actual lit substation a mile off, and nothing else. No lights, no smear, no anomaly, just winter dark, exactly like every other frame either of them had ever shot out here. "Check the time on it," he said, not sure why he wanted that, just wanting something to measure the moment against. She checked. Her face changed. "Says 6:47. That's not right. I hit the brights right around 6:43, maybe 6:44. You took that picture 2 seconds after. I know when I took it too, Dale." And the phone says 6:47, 4 minutes. Neither of them could account for where those 4 minutes had gone, and both of them were certain, in the stubborn way people get certain about small things right after something big has rattled them, that the timestamp was wrong and their own memory was right. Except Dale's truck ran an ELD, a government-mandated logging device that tracked his drive time to the minute for compliance. No room for a driver's memory to argue with it. When he pulled up the log that night in the truck stop lot, there was a 4-minute stretch logged as on duty not driving, a full stop, GPS coordinates sitting him dead still, on a stretch of I-80. He had absolute certainty he'd been rolling through the entire time. Wind and blade and wheel fighting him the whole way. The device didn't lie for insurance reasons, if nothing else. Something had stopped him for 4 minutes he didn't have any memory of losing. They rolled into the Antelope Ridge site a little after 8, blade delivered, Storm still holding off by a slim margin. The site foreman who signed his paperwork, a heavy-set guy named Purcell, who'd clearly been doing this job long enough to be unbothered by most things, didn't blink when Dale mentioned the lights, almost like he'd been braced for it before Dale finished the sentence. "Pad 14, Purcell said. "It wasn't a question. How'd you know that?" "Because you're not the first driver this season to bring it up, and it's always 14. He said it plain, tired, the way a man says something he's stopped being surprised by. "We had a survey crew quit over it back in September. I don't ask anymore. I just log the pad as delayed and move the schedule around it." Dale asked what was actually holding 14 up, since the delivery notes had only ever said easement review, and Purcell's answer was shorter than he expected. "Not our call." Above the company's pay grade, was how he put it, and pointed out that the access road running up to that pad had its own gate now, separate from the rest of the site fencing, with a placard on it that didn't carry the wind company's logo at all. Some federal contractor name Dale didn't recognize, stenciled small and government plain, the kind of sign that told you nothing on purpose. It nagged at him enough that a few weeks later, back home in Cheyenne between runs, he brought it up to an old friend who'd grown up outside Rollins and knew the county better than any map. The friend didn't seem surprised either. Told him that stretch of high plains had sat inside the old Minuteman missile field for decades. F.E. Warren's silos scattered out under that ground long after most of them got deactivated and capped, and that when the wind company first surveyed the section for turbine pads, 2 of them had to be relocated because of unresolved subsurface rights nobody in the county could get a straight answer about, 14 being one of the 2. Nothing in that explained 3 lights holding steady in gale force wind or a missing 4 minutes on a logging device. But it gave the story a shape that wasn't aliens and wasn't nothing either. Just old ground with old business still buried in it that the government hadn't finished being quiet about. Dale never got a clean answer, and in a way that bothered him more than a clean answer would have. What he got instead, about a month after the delivery, was a call from dispatch, friendly, procedural, telling him he was being pulled off the Rollins corridor going forward. Load balancing, nothing personal, plenty of freight heading south toward Denver instead. He hadn't asked to come off that route. Nobody explained why it was him specifically. When he tried calling Renee to see if she'd caught wind of the same thing, her number rang through to a different escort company's dispatch line, and the woman who answered had never heard of her. He still tells it the same way every time. Careful about the order, because he knows how these stories get exaggerated in the retelling, and he doesn't want his to. 3 lights, dead still in wind that was shoving a 5-ton blade sideways. The half-second where it was somehow beautiful, before the fear caught up to him. Something so massive and empty out there, holding so still, it felt like the whole high plain was paying attention to him for a moment, before his gut caught up to his eyes and told him to be afraid. The brights going up, the lights cutting out on his beam, and not a heartbeat before it, no matter what Renee swore she saw. And the 4 minutes, gone from a device that wasn't supposed to be capable of being wrong, sitting on his old paperwork to this day. A stop he never made, on a road he was fighting the whole way down. Renee Castillo had been driving trucks for 8 years, and in that time she'd learned the difference between the sounds that meant something and the sounds that didn't. A flat made a specific slap, rubber against asphalt, in a broken rhythm that got worse the longer you ignored it. A loose strap banged loose and random, catching wind at odd angles. She knew these sounds the way she knew her own heartbeat, and that was why, somewhere around mile marker 16 on Highway 101, rolling through the Redwood Corridor at 2 in the morning, with 60,000 pounds of strawberries losing their window behind her, the thumping under the trailer stopped making sense. It wasn't broken. It wasn't random. It came every second and a half, steady as a metronome, directly beneath the belly of the trailer, and it didn't change when she hit a rough patch of road, or smoothed out on a clean stretch. The road didn't control it. Something else did. She eased off the throttle and found a wide shoulder cut into the trees, hazards ticking, fog pressing so thick against her windshield that her headlights just bounced light back at her instead of cutting through it. She climbed down with her flashlight, checked all 18 tires, ran her hand along the frame, got down on her knees on the wet gravel, and looked up into the undercarriage. Nothing. No loose panel, no dragging chain, no blown tire, nothing hanging, nothing dented. The reefer unit hummed along fine, holding 34 degrees like it should. She stood there a long moment, with fog beating on her jacket, and the stillness of everything checking out, perfectly bothered her more than finding something wrong would have. Wrong she could fix. This was just quiet, and cold, and clean. She climbed back into the cab, pulled onto the highway, and got up to speed. The thumping came back inside a quarter mile. Not close to where it had been. Not similar. Exactly the same interval. And now she noticed something she hadn't let herself notice the first time. It sped up when she sped up, and slowed when she eased off the pedal, matching her speed with a precision that no dragging part or damaged tire could manage. Whatever was making that sound was pacing her. She reached for the CB out of habit more than hope, keyed it, and asked if anybody was running the corridor tonight. A man's voice came back fast, like he'd been waiting on that channel, and told her his handle was Ironbark, and he was about 4 miles ahead of her, empty trailer, heading south. She asked him, trying to keep her voice level, if he'd heard anything odd through that stretch by the Big Bend near mile 18. There was a pause long enough that she thought she'd lost him. Then he said, low, that some drivers didn't take that stretch anymore after dark if they had a choice, and that she should keep her speed steady and not stop for anything that wasn't a badge or a flare. She asked what he meant by that. The radio gave her nothing back but static, and when she tried his handle again, nobody answered. The reefer alarm went off 2 minutes later, a hard electronic bark from the dash that made her flinch so bad she nearly drifted the lane. The display read a 2-degree spike, 36 climbing, which for berries this close to their cutoff was the kind of number that could cost her the whole load, and the bonus that came with delivering it on time. She grabbed for the manual override, and before her hand even reached the panel, the number dropped back to 34 on its own, steady, like nothing had happened. The thumping hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten a little heavier, like something had shifted its weight. She checked her mirror without thinking, the way you check mirrors 1,000 times a night without really looking, and this time something made her actually look. Low along the trailer's flank, right where the fog met the running lights, there was a long, pale smear, low to the ground, moving at the same speed as the truck, there in the mirror, and gone, when she turned her head to look through the side window directly. She told herself it was fog catching the light wrong. She told herself that twice, which was usually the sign that she didn't believe it the first time. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a memory surfaced that she hadn't thought about in years. From her second season driving, sitting in a truck stop outside Crescent City, listening to an old-timer named Wally talk about a driver who'd hauled this same corridor regularly, and then 1 week just stopped showing up at the yard. Nobody made a big story out of it at the time. Drivers quit. Drivers moved on. Drivers had reasons that weren't anybody's business. But Wally had said the guy told him once, half joking, that he never ran the Redwood stretch without a full tank and a reason to keep moving, because stopping in there for no reason was how you found out you'd had company the whole way through and just didn't know it. She hadn't thought about that conversation in 6 years. She thought about it now, with her hands tight on the wheel. Every part of her wanted to pull over again, get out, check one more time, but she made herself do the math instead. Another stop meant another 20 minutes lost, and the berries were already riding close enough to their limit that the 2-degree spike alone might have put a mark on the load. Stopping wouldn't fix a sound she couldn't find the source of. So she kept her foot steady on the pedal and her eyes on the white line, and told herself that was the responsible choice, not the frightened one, even though some part of her recognized the difference wasn't as clean as she wanted it to be. The rhythm under the trailer changed again a few miles on, and this time it wasn't a shift in speed, it was a shift in position. The thumping had been steady, under the rear axles since it started. Now it was coming from further forward, closer to the fifth wheel, closer to the back wall of her own cab. Like whatever was keeping pace with her had decided the rear of the truck wasn't interesting anymore. She picked up the radio to raise dispatch, got as far as keying the mic before she stopped herself and put it back down. She didn't know what she'd say. Ricky at dispatch was a good guy, but he ran on schedules and fuel receipts and delivery windows, and telling him she wanted to reroute because something was pacing her trailer through the redwoods was the kind of thing that got you a psych eval before your next load got assigned. So instead, she just said she'd hit some construction markers and wanted to swing the coast road on the way back, and he said fine, noted it, no questions. She'd decide later how she felt about the lie. Right now, she just needed to get through the trees. The fog didn't thin so much as it changed character. The deep, old-growth dark of the corridor, starting to open up into something wider, saltier, and she caught the first hint of the coastline, pushing back against the tree line ahead. She was watching for it now, waiting, and when the trailer finally rolled past the last stand of big trunks and the road opened onto the exposed coastal shoulder, the thumping stopped. Not faded, stopped. mid-beat, like someone had lifted a needle off a record. The silence that came after was almost louder than the sound had been. She drove another 5 miles before she let her shoulders come down from around her ears, and even then she kept checking the mirror every few seconds out of a habit she knew wasn't going away anytime soon. She made her delivery window with 11 minutes to spare. The receiving manager at the distribution center didn't say anything about the load looking off, didn't flag temperature, signed the paperwork like it was any other Tuesday morning. She told herself that meant it was fine, that whatever had happened in those trees hadn't actually touched anything that mattered. And she almost believed it until 3 days later, when the shop pulled the reefer's data log for a routine service check and called her over to look at the printout. There it was in black and white, a clean 2-degree spike right in the window. She'd have been rolling through the corridor, climbing, and then dropping back to set point over a span of about 6 minutes. No compressor fault logged, no door sensor triggered, no power interruption anywhere in the unit's history. The tech who pulled it shrugged and said, "Sometimes units just glitch, temperature sensors drift, nothing to worry about since it's self-corrected." Renee nodded and signed off on it, and didn't mention the thumping, didn't mention Ironbark going quiet on the radio, didn't mention Wally's story from 6 years back, that she now couldn't stop turning over in her head. What she did do, without really deciding to, was pull up the load board 2 weeks later, and specifically bid on a run that kept her off 101 through that stretch, taking the longer inland route even though it cost her 40 extra minutes and a chunk of her bonus. She told Ricky it was about avoiding a way station backup. He didn't ask twice. It was almost a month later, waiting on a load at a yard outside Redding, that she overheard 2 other drivers by the coffee machine talking low about a corridor run gone strange. One of them saying something had paced his flatbed for 6 miles, through fog so thick he never saw so much as an outline, just felt it, the same rhythm, the same speed match, right down near the same stretch of road. Renee stood there with her cup halfway to her mouth and didn't say a word, didn't tell them she knew exactly what he meant, just listened, until they moved on to talking about fuel prices instead. She never did find out what the shop's temperature log actually explained, because it never explained anything at all. She just kept driving, kept her tank full through that stretch from then on, and never asked out loud whether it had been alone that night, or whether it had simply decided, for reasons that belonged to it and not to her, that 6 miles was enough. The road drops off Route 60, about 4 miles past Hiko, cuts along the ridge, and dips into country, where the trees still outnumber the people 300 to 1. Dale Coleman had run that stretch for 31 years, hauling dry goods for a distributor out of Beckley. The same route so many times, his hands turned the wheel before his eyes caught the curve. He was 59, 6 months from a retirement party he didn't want, driving a load of canned goods and paper towels through the blue hour, when the sky goes the color of a healing bruise and the hollows start swallowing the light early. That's when he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, low and fast, a shape dropping toward Turkey Foot Hollow, a place he knew held nothing but timber and one collapsed logging road that hadn't seen a truck since Reagan was in office. No engine sound, no blinking wingtip lights. Just a silent disk of white-blue brightness falling behind the tree line like a stone dropped in still water. His gut did what 30 years of driving trained it to do. He eased off the gas, braced for the flash of fire, the column of smoke, the CB radio lighting up with somebody screaming about a plane down. None of that came. No glow through the trees, no smell of fuel burning. Just the ordinary dark, settling back in, like nothing had happened at all. He pulled into the Marathon station, up at the Anstead exit, telling himself he needed coffee, though his hands were shaking too much to trust holding the cup. The kid behind the counter, maybe 22, barely looked up from his phone when Dale asked if there'd been any word of a crash out past Turkey Foot. The kid said no, and then, almost as an afterthought, said Dale was the 3rd trucker that week to ask him the exact same thing. Same hollow. Same time of evening, give or take 20 minutes. Dale stood there with his coffee going cold in his hand, feeling something shift under his feet that had nothing to do with the tile floor. He didn't sleep right that night, but when he got home, he didn't say a word of it to Carol. She'd spent 3 decades flinching every time the phone rang late, and he wasn't about to hand her one more thing to lay awake over. But the coincidence gnawed at him in a way that surprised him. Not fear exactly, something closer to grief, though he couldn't have told you what he thought he'd lost. 2 nights later, working the same route, he stopped at the little diner in Victor, where he'd eaten more meals than in his own kitchen, and asked the waitress, an old girl named Sherry, who'd been pouring coffee there since before his first marriage, if she'd heard anything about lights out past Turkey Foot. She got quiet in a way that told him she had. She said her cousin drove for a propane outfit and had seen the same thing, same spot, and what got her wasn't that he'd seen it. It was that he swore it happened at almost the same minute each time, like something running on a schedule. Dale sat with that a long while, because a crash doesn't keep a schedule. A crash is one time and it's over. This was doing something else. It was Sherry, actually, who cracked the next piece open without meaning to. She mentioned, wiping down the counter, that Turkey Foot used to have a name before the county renamed it on the maps sometime in the 90s. Folks who'd been around long enough still called it Corbin Hollow, after the mine that used to sit up in there. Dale went still over his coffee. He hadn't thought about the Corbin mine in years. Not on purpose, anyway. His older brother Wendell had worked there. Wendell had been underground on the morning in November of 1987, when the roof came down on the number 9 seam, and Wendell had never come back up. Dale had been 28 then, driving this same kind of route for a smaller outfit, and he remembered standing at the mouth of that hollow for 2 days, with the other families while company men in clean boots told them nothing useful. The official count, when it finally came, was 6 men lost. Wendell's body, along with 2 others, was never recovered. The company said the section was too unstable to risk more lives retrieving the dead, and the mine was sealed within the month. Dale hadn't set foot near that hollow in 37 years. He hadn't needed to. It had never once occurred to him the road he drove for a living ran within a mile of the place his brother was still buried in rock. That was the week his driving started to slip. Missed his exit twice. Sat through a green light on Route 16 long enough that the guy behind him laid on the horn. Carol noticed. She always noticed. And asked him straight out what was eating at him. And for the first time in their marriage, he lied to her, without even deciding to. Said it was just tired. She didn't push, but he saw her watching him over the newspaper that night, like she was doing math she didn't like the answer to. He couldn't leave it alone. 2 weeks after the first sighting, running late on a delivery anyway, he pulled his rig onto the shoulder near the old logging cut and did something he never in 31 years had done. He got out and walked into the hollow on foot, flashlight in hand, telling himself he'd turn back the second it felt stupid. It felt stupid almost immediately. It didn't stop him. He found the fence about half a mile in, chain link, newer than everything around it, strung with orange survey tape, and behind it a portable trailer with a generator humming low and a satellite dish bolted to the roof. Not a spaceship, not fire, not wreckage. Men, in reflective vests and hard hats, standing around a rig that looked less like mining equipment and more like something a geology crew would haul. Ground-penetrating radar, cables running into the dirt, a drone case open on a folding table. The lights he and 2 other drivers had watched drop out of the sky weren't dropping from the sky at all. They were mounted on a survey drone, flying low sweeps down into the hollow after dark, when thermal contrast read best, coming in fast and quiet on electric rotors that made almost no sound from 400 yards off through hardwood. A man in his 40s with a State Department of Environmental Protection badge clipped to his vest caught Dale standing at the fence and came over more curious than angry. Dale gave his name without thinking about it, the way you do, and watched the man's face change. "Coleman!" He asked if Dale was kin to Wendell Coleman, and Dale said he was his brother, and the man went quiet in the particular way people go quiet when they're deciding how much truth a stranger can carry. What he told Dale, once he'd decided, unraveled something that had sat sealed for 37 years, same as that mine. New subsidence readings the year before had shown movement in the old number 9 seam, enough that the state ordered a survey before the land above it, slated to become part of a reclaimed trail system, could be opened to the public. The radar sweeps had picked up a void that shouldn't have been there, and inside it, mixed with debris that had shifted over decades, what looked very much like remains. They hadn't gone public yet. Company records were still being cross-checked, because the survey team wanted certainty before they knocked on anybody's door and reopened a wound that old. Dale drove home that night not knowing whether what he felt was hope or something closer to dread, wearing hope's coat. He told Carol everything, finally, sitting at the kitchen table past midnight, and she listened without once looking surprised, and that alone told him something was wrong before she ever opened her mouth. She'd known. Not about the drone or the lights, that part she hadn't heard until now, but about the survey itself. She'd been the one to petition the state 2 years earlier, using the settlement money from the original accident case that Dale had never wanted touched, hiring a retired mine inspector to push the paperwork through channels Dale didn't know existed. She hadn't told him, because years back, worn down and grieving, he'd asked her to let Wendell rest and stop chasing an answer that wasn't coming. She'd agreed to his face and kept going behind his back, not out of deceit, she said, but because she couldn't watch him retire from that road without knowing, one way or another, what he'd been driving past his whole career. The identification came back 6 weeks later, right around Dale's last week on the route. It wasn't the clean answer either of them had braced for. The remains recovered from the void weren't only Wendell's. There were traces of 4 sets, not 3. In a section of that mine, the original 1987 report listed as containing only 3 missing men. Someone, at some point in the company's accounting, had left a 4th name off the record entirely, a contract miner from 2 counties over, with no local family to press for answers, whose disappearance had simply been folded into the story as a man who'd quit and moved on. 37 years, and it turned out the grief Dale had been hauling wasn't only his family's. It belonged to people who never even knew there was something to grieve. On his last run down that stretch of road, the week before his retirement dinner, Dale slowed near Turkey Foot Hollow out of habit more than anything else. No light dropped through the trees that evening. The drone crews were long gone, the trailer packed up, the fence coming down to make way for a trail marker, and a small stone plaque the state had agreed, after some pushing from Carol, to put up with all 4 names on it. He sat idling on the shoulder longer than he needed to, engine running, hands loose on the wheel, and for the first time in 31 years of driving that road, the sadness in his chest finally had a shape he could put a name to. He put the truck in gear and drove on, the way he always had, except this time, he knew exactly what he was leaving behind in that hollow, and exactly what he was finally, after all these years, allowed to let go of. I've told this story flat for a long time now. Not because it doesn't matter to me anymore, but because the first few times I told it, with the shake still in my voice, people started looking at me different. The way you look at somebody you're not sure you can trust behind the wheel anymore. So I learned to tell it the boring way. Manifest voice, just the facts, low and even, like I'm reading off a bill of lading. It's easier for everybody that way, including me. Me and my wife Carla have run produce together for going on 18 years. Watermelon, squash, tomatoes when they're in. Whatever the co-op outside Bluntstown needs move down to the distributor near Apalachicola before the Tuesday market opens. It's a night run most of the summer, because the heat cooks the fruit if you haul it in daylight, and because the truck stops and the scale houses are quieter after dark. We know the route, the way you know, your own kitchen in the dark. State Road 65, the stretch that runs along the edge of Tate's Hell, swamp on both sides thick enough that your headlights just disappear into it past the shoulder. No towns to speak of. Maybe 2 gas stations in 40 miles, both closed by 9. That night was peak summer, the kind of humid where the air feels like it's already been breathed by somebody else. We were running between storm cells, which you learn to do down here. The radar shows you gaps, and you thread through them, because if you wait for clear sky in July, you'll wait until October. Carla was asleep in the passenger seat, with her sun hat pulled down over her eyes out of habit, even though it was pitch dark. We had a hard window, 6 a.m. at the dock, and we were making good time. I remember the dash gauges flickered first. Not the stutter you get from a bad ground or a loose battery cable, which I've seen plenty of in 20-some years of driving. This was even. 3 times, evenly spaced, like something breathing slow. I remember thinking, that's not electrical. That's not how electrical looks. And then the whole truck just died. Not stalled, died. Engine, headlights, dash, radio, the little charge indicator on the CB, all of it, gone at once, like someone had reached in and pulled every plug in the house at the same second. No sputter, no dimming down, just full dark and full silence, and 18,000 pounds of truck and trailer coasting on its own weight down a swamp road at 11 o'clock at night. I didn't have time to be scared yet. I was too busy trying to keep her straight on the road by feel, no power steering, wrestling a dead wheel with a load of watermelon pushing from behind. That part was just physics and adrenaline. What came after wasn't. Something went over us. Low. I want to be precise about this, because I've had 15 years to think about how to say it, and I still don't have better words. I didn't see a shape so much as I felt one pass, a change in the air pressure inside the cab, the same feeling you get when a plane starts its descent and your ears want to pop. There was no rotor wash, no engine whine, no running lights blinking red and white the way the FAA makes every legal aircraft carry. Just a weight moving overhead, slow, wrong slow, the kind of slow that big things aren't supposed to be able to do without falling out of the sky. It crossed the gap in the storm clouds for maybe 2 seconds and blotted out enough stars that I knew, even in the dark, that it was bigger than anything, with no sound had any business being. Then the truck just came back on, all of it, all at once, same as it left. Headlights snapped up mid-beam like they'd never been off. Engine caught and ran smooth like I hadn't taken my foot off anything, and the radio picked back up mid-song. Not the start of a song, the middle of one. Glenn Campbell, Wichita lineman. I want to tell you, that wouldn't mean anything to most people, and it wouldn't have meant anything to me either, except that was the song that was on the radio the night my daddy died, on that same stretch of road, when I was 16 years old, riding shotgun in his own truck. I hadn't heard that particular song come on the radio, by chance, in the middle of the night, on that road, one single time in 29 years. And there it was, dead center of the chorus, like it had been waiting on us. Carla woke up from the noise of the engine catching, not from anything before it. She never saw the dark, never felt the pressure, never heard the song start over in her head the way I did. She just sat up disoriented and asked why I was gripping the wheel like that. Both hands, white-knuckled, arms locked. I told her a possum, told her I'd swerved. She went back to sleep inside of 10 minutes. We made the 6 a.m. dock with 11 minutes to spare, which at the time felt like a small mercy, and I didn't think much harder about the math of that until later. It was maybe 3 weeks after, going through the electronic log for an unrelated DOT thing, that I noticed our drive time for that leg didn't sit right. I'm not talking about the 11 seconds. I didn't even know about the 11 seconds yet. I'm talking about the whole run clocking in 18 minutes longer than it should have, given our average speed, given the mile markers, given everything except a total stop that neither of us remembered taking. 18 minutes is not 11 seconds. 18 minutes is enough time to do quite a lot to a person, or have quite a lot done, and neither of us had any memory of where those minutes went. I didn't say anything to Carla about the math. I told myself I'd misread the log. I started sleeping bad instead, which she noticed even if she didn't know why, and I started taking the long way around certain conversations, and I know now that's when the numbness I talk with today really started setting in. You don't decide to go numb. You just find, one day, that you've been doing it a while, like a callus you didn't feel form. What I did instead of talking to my wife was start reading, late at night, on my phone, in the cab, while she slept beside me on runs, the way you'd pick at a scab. Trucker forums, CB relay boards, the kind of places where guys post about deer strikes and DOT checkpoints. Buried in there, going back almost 11 years, I found 4 other posts, different handles, different rigs, all describing the same stretch of 65 along Tate's Hell, all between 10 and 1 in the morning, always summer, always storm season, full power loss. No sound overhead, restart on its own, 30, 40, once as much as 60 feet down the road. One guy wrote it off as ball lightning and got argued out of the thread. Nobody connected it to missing time, because near as I could tell, nobody else had thought to check. I took the truck in not long after that for a rough idle. Nothing to do with any of this. And Sonny Prater, who's kept our rigs running for going on 15 years, pulled the diagnostic history out of habit while he had it hooked up. He got quiet looking at the screen, told me the module logged a full power interruption lasting exactly 11 seconds on the date I'd told him about, offhand, weeks before, half joking, thinking he'd laugh it off. He didn't laugh. He said there was no battery disconnect event recorded anywhere around it, no fault code consistent with it, nothing, in 15 years of doing this, that explained a total loss and clean restart, with no physical break in the circuit, he said. And I remember this exact. That's not a thing that should be possible. Then he sat there another second, looking at the screen like it might change, and told me, quieter, that it was the 3rd one he'd seen logged exactly like that this year alone, off 3 different trucks, and that he wasn't going to tell me whose. He wouldn't take my money for the diagnostic pull. He told me to let it be. I couldn't let it be, though I didn't tell Carla that either. I drove out to see my Uncle Curtis, who spent better than 20 years doing contract groundwork near the test range down toward the coast, the kind of work where you sign papers that outlast your memory of signing them. I didn't ask him straight out. I didn't have to. I described the road and the time of night and the way the thing moved, and he got a look on his face I'd only seen on him once before, at my daddy's funeral. He told me there's flying that happens out over that corridor that nobody who does it will ever confirm to a soul, low and slow and quiet on purpose, and that men who worked near it for 30 years still don't fully understand everything it does to the ground underneath it. Then he told me, flat, that none of that explained missing minutes, or a song coming back on cue, and that I ought to stop asking people who might not appreciate the questions. 2 days after that, a gray pickup with county tags sat at the end of our drive for the better part of an hour before pulling off, engine running the whole time, nobody getting out. Sonny called me the following week to say somebody'd come by the shop asking to see recent diagnostic pulls, specifically ones flagging power interruption events, and that he'd told them he didn't keep those on file, which wasn't entirely true. I want to be clear, I'm not a man who goes looking for conspiracies. I've voted the same way my whole life, and I've never once called in about a light in the sky. But I know what it is to feel looked at, and I felt looked at. That was the thing that finally cracked me open with Carla. Not the truck, not the song, but coming in from the barn one evening and finding her sitting at the kitchen table with the DOT log printed out, the 18 minutes circled in pen, asking me quiet why I'd never mentioned it. I told her everything then, all of it. Sonny, Curtis, the forum posts, the song, sitting across from her at our own table like I was confessing to something. She didn't call me crazy. She sat there a long minute and then told me something she'd never told me in 18 years of marriage. Before we met, when she was 22 and running with her own father hauling citrus, they'd had a night on that same stretch, same time of year, same hour. She described the pressure in her ears before she ever heard me say the word pressure. She described the quiet, bigger and heavier than regular quiet, before I'd finished the sentence, Her father never talked about it again after that night, and died 11 years back without her ever getting him to. She'd buried it the same way I'd buried mine, telling herself it was heat exhaustion, a dream half remembered, anything smaller than what it was. That was the second time in one conversation the ground moved under me, because it meant this wasn't about us. Wasn't some one-time thing that had picked our truck out of all the trucks on 65 that summer. It had a memory longer than either of our marriages. It had been happening to people on that road for at least as long as two separate families had been driving it, and neither family had ever compared notes, because you don't. You tell yourself the smaller story instead. That sent me back, finally, to the file on my father. I'd never once pulled the actual report, not in 29 years, because 16-year-old boys don't request accident files on their own daddy, and 45-year-old men mostly don't either, not until something makes them. The county still had it on record. Single vehicle, they'd ruled it. Cardiac event behind the wheel, and I'd grown up believing that meant he'd had a heart attack driving and drifted off. But the responding deputy's note, typed up decades ago, and never once read by me until that afternoon, said the truck was found already stopped on the shoulder, engine off, no skid marks anywhere on the pavement, hazards never engaged. A man having a heart attack behind the wheel does not, as a rule, manage to safely pull his own rig onto the shoulder and shut the engine down first. And I was in that truck that night. I have always told people I don't remember much of it. That shock does that to a kid. I know now that isn't the whole truth. I have a hole in that night about the size and shape of 18 minutes. And until Carla put that DOT log on the table, I had never once measured it. So that's where it sits. Not a story about a light in the sky one time, but about a road that has been doing this, patient as anything, to whoever drives it enough nights in a row, for at least 2 generations of 2 families that never crossed paths until they married each other. Something out there is either testing what it can take from people or testing what people will let themselves forget, and I honestly don't know anymore which one scares me worse. We talked about routing around it, costed it out more than once. The long way adds 50 extra minutes and a second toll, and on a produce run with a market deadline and margins thin enough already, 50 minutes is the difference between a contract we keep and one we lose to somebody hungrier. We asked about the bridge route, and it's been closed for repair going on a year with no date posted for reopening. There isn't another way that gets the truck there on time, not one the business can survive on paper. So we still run it. Less at night, when we can help it, though July doesn't leave you many other choices down here. We were on it again 3 nights ago, between storm cells, same as always. Carla awake this time, both of us quiet, both of us watching the tree line instead of talking. About 4 miles past the co-op turnoff, right around the same mile marker, I felt the dash lights give the smallest flicker. Once, twice, a third time, even and spaced, like something taking a slow breath before it decides whether to speak. I didn't say anything to her. I just gripped the wheel a little tighter and kept my foot steady on the pedal, and I waited to see if this was going to be the night it finally told me the rest. The night Wade Kessler saw the sky do something it shouldn't. He was 40 minutes past Flagstaff, empty 2-lane pines giving way to the flat, dark stretch where the plateau opens up and the elevation signs start reading over 7,000 feet. He'd been driving for 6 hours straight, hauling a stranger's whole life in the back of his trailer. A walnut dining set, boxes marked kitchen and dad's books, and fragile in a shaky hand, the leftovers of somebody's downsized house. He'd taken the run on short notice, because taking runs on short notice was what he did now. 4 months divorced, and the quiet of an empty apartment did something to him that the quiet of a truck cab never did. At least in the truck the silence had a reason. The snow had started an hour back, the light dry kind that doesn't stick so much as drift, and he'd had the wipers on intermittent, barely needed. Then, somewhere past mile marker 195, he noticed it wasn't falling straight anymore. It was bending, not blowing sideways the way snow does in a crosswind. He had 30 knots coming hard off his left flank. He could feel it shoving the trailer, correcting for it without thinking. But this snow was curving in a lazy arc overhead, like it was going around something. He leaned into the windshield and looked up, the way you do when your body knows before your mind does, and found a piece of the sky simply gone. Not clouded over, gone. A clean wedge of nothing, edges hard enough to trace, blotting out a whole shelf of stars that had been there a second before. It held its shape against that same wind that was rocking his trailer. That was the part his brain kept snagging on afterward, turning over and over. Whatever it wasn't being pushed. It was sitting in that gust, like the gust wasn't there. Then, in the space of maybe 3 seconds, it slid forward. Not drifted, slid, the way something moves when it's decided to move, and covered ground no wind on earth was making that night. And the stars underneath it just came back on, one patch at a time, like a light passing over a room. He didn't remember pulling onto the shoulder so much as finding himself already stopped, hazards ticking, engine idling low under him. He sat there for 20 minutes. Not scared exactly, more like a man standing at the edge of a hole in the ground he can't see the bottom of, in no hurry to throw a rock in and start guessing. And then, without deciding to, he picked up his phone and called Renee. It was 1 a.m. He fully expected voicemail. She answered on the second ring, and her voice didn't have any of the fog of sleep in it at all. "Hey," she said, like she'd been sitting there with the phone in her hand. "I was just thinking about calling you," he asked, careful, if everything was okay. She said, "Yeah, fine, just up, packing stuff into boxes for the move. Couldn't sleep." They talked for 11 minutes about nothing. Her sister's new dog, a leak under his sink he still hadn't fixed, and he never once mentioned the sky. But something about how fast she'd picked up, how awake she already was, sat next to the thing overhead and didn't quite fit anywhere, and he carried both of them back onto the highway with him. He made Ash Fork before his hours ran out, backed into a truck stop, and slept 4 hours in the bunk with the heater ticking. When he climbed down at first light to do his walk-around, he saw it before he'd even finished his coffee, a patch on the trailer roof where no snow had settled overnight, clean aluminum showing through a half-inch of white everywhere else, in a shape he stood there trying to name and couldn't. Not a circle, not an oval, nothing his eye wanted to file as ordinary. He climbed the ladder and ran his glove over it, half expecting heat, some leftover warmth that would explain it as engine exhaust venting wrong. It was cold as the rest of the metal. When he checked the load inside, the straps were tight, tension where he'd left it. But the box marked Dad's books had been turned 90 degrees from how he'd wedged it, the flaps not torn, just loose, like someone had opened it and set it back, without much care for how it had been. He didn't think much of that last part until the diner, 2 hours later, when he mentioned the sky thing to a driver at the counter, an old-timer named Ruiz who ran this same stretch twice a month and had the look of a man who'd stopped being surprised by things around 1995. Ruiz didn't laugh. He set his fork down, pulled out his phone, and showed Wade a private group, driver only, 400-some members, a running thread going back 6 years, of guys describing almost exactly what Wade had seen. Always this stretch, always late winter into early spring, always somewhere in that same 20-mile band of highway. "Every year," Ruiz said, "guys stop talking about it after the first time somebody laughs at them. Don't mean it stops happening." Back in the cab, waiting on his delivery window, Wade pulled the manifest to kill time, and something about the pickup address needled him. An estate liquidation out of a house near Winona, the shipper listed as deceased, the delivery going to a residential address he didn't recognize, but that nagged at him anyway, the way a name does right before you remember whose it is. He set it aside as nothing. Coincidence didn't need his help. At the next stop, waiting on a way station line, he finally looked in the disturbed box. Company policy let him check for shipping damage, and that was reason enough. Under a layer of old sweaters, he found a stack of spiral notebooks. Decades of them by the handwriting alone, dated in a shaky hand going back to 1987. Pages of nothing but sky notes. Times, wind speeds, cloud cover, and sketches. The same wedge, drawn over and over across 40 years, sometimes with a date circled twice, like the man had wanted to be sure he wasn't repeating himself by accident. Whoever had packed this box had died, and whoever he'd been, he'd spent half his life writing down the exact thing Wade had watched happen 8 hours earlier. That night, parked at his mandatory rest stop outside Kingman, he called Renee again, and this time he told her all of it. The snow, the wedge, the notebooks. He expected her to go quiet the way people do when they're deciding whether to worry about you. Instead, she went quiet a different way, and then said, "Careful. You remember the camping trip, before we got married. Havasu Canyon." He did. Barely. A blurred memory filed under too tired to be reliable. She reminded him, a patch of sky gone dark over the rim for the length of a held breath, both of them dismissing it the next morning as exhaustion and bad tequila. Neither of them had brought it up again in 15 years of marriage. Now she was bringing it up unprompted, on her own, like it had been sitting in her the whole time waiting for permission. The estate contact called dispatch the next morning to confirm delivery timing, and dispatch passed Wade the message loose, the way dispatch passes everything. The deceased shipper had died 6 weeks back. The move was for his son, who was combining households with someone. Nothing more than routine chatter, but it meant the man whose 40 years of sky-watching Wade was now hauling in a cardboard box hadn't just died. He'd died mid-project, unfinished, and Wade was the one carrying what was left of it toward whoever was next. He made the final delivery just after 2 in the afternoon, pulling the rig down a residential street with the GPS calling turns, and it wasn't until he was backing toward the driveway that he saw her standing on the porch in a coat she'd owned since before the divorce, watching the trailer come in, like she couldn't quite make her eyes agree with what they were seeing. Renee, his Renee, or what used to be his, standing in front of a house he'd never seen, waiting on furniture he hadn't known was headed anywhere near her. The dispatch swap that had put him on this run 3 days ago had never crossed with the address on a delivery slip until the exact moment it no longer mattered which name he recognized first. They stood in the driveway a long minute before either of them said anything useful. She hadn't requested him. She hadn't known which driver the company would send, hadn't thought to ask, hadn't imagined the two threads. Her calls with her ex-husband about a light in the sky and her new partner's dead father's furniture would arrive at her front door on the same axle. Curtis came out then, a man Wade sized up without meaning to, and found nothing to dislike, which somehow made it harder. Nobody raised their voice. Renee said quietly that the calls this week had meant more to her than she'd expected them to, and Wade said the same back, and that was as far as either of them pushed it, because both of them understood, without saying so, that meaning something to each other again wasn't the same as going back. Weather closed the pass that evening, freak spring system dumping 6 inches in 2 hours, and Wade's dispatcher told him to sit tight till morning. He ended up parked in Renee's driveway instead of a lot, which felt stranger to admit than it should have. Around 1, unable to sleep, he stepped out into the cold to walk it off, and found Renee already outside on the porch steps, arms crossed over a borrowed jacket, looking up. Neither of them said why they'd come out at that hour. They didn't have to. It arrived the same as it had for him on the highway 3 nights before. The snow bending, the stars folding shut in that same hard-edged wedge, except this time, it was low enough and close enough that he heard Renee's breath catch beside him, and when she said his name out loud, quiet, almost a question, the shape above them seemed to hang there a half-second longer than it had any reason to, before it slid off toward the ridge and let the sky close back up behind it. Neither of them tried to explain that pause. They just stood there together until the cold ran them back inside, and for the first time since the divorce, being near her didn't feel like standing in a room he used to live in. In the morning, going through the last of the boxes with Curtis, before he pulled out, Wade found an envelope taped inside the lid of the final crate, addressed in that same shaking hand, to whoever delivers this. Inside was a short letter and a single photograph, cracked at the corners, dated in pencil on the back. 1991. The same stretch of highway, the same wedge of missing stars, caught on old film by a man who'd apparently spent his whole life making sure somebody besides him would eventually see it too. The letter didn't claim to know what it was. It only said he'd watched it come and go for over 30 years, never closer to an answer, and that not knowing hadn't ruined him the way he used to think it would. Wade left the photograph and the notebooks with Curtis, figuring they belonged to that house now more than to him. He pulled out a little after 9, the roads freshly plowed, sun flat and hard off the new snow. Somewhere past Seligman he stopped for fuel, and while the pump ran, he walked around the cab out of habit and found a strip of frost cleared clean off one corner of his windshield, in a shape he didn't try very hard to name this time. He didn't call anyone about it. He didn't pull his phone out to photograph it either. He just stood there a minute in the cold, looking at it, and then got back in the truck and pointed it toward the interstate, done needing to know what it meant, glad only that it had been there at all. Dale Kessler had been hauling cattle for 15 years, and in this business that's long enough to see just about everything twice. Blown tires in July heat that could fry an egg off the hood. Ice storms outside haze that turned the interstate into a parking lot for 2 days straight. A load that shifted wrong outside Pratt one time and nearly put him in the ditch with 6,000 pounds of feeder steers behind him. 15 years of it wears most of the fear out of a man and replaces it with something more useful. The kind of calm that comes from already having lived through the worst nights the job can throw at you. It had also made him the guy on Channel 19 who shut the conversation down whenever the lights in the sky talk started up. Every trucker who's spent enough nights alone on a dark highway has heard somebody swear they saw something they couldn't explain, and every one of those stories, in Dale's experience, came down to a plane, a weather balloon, a satellite catching the sun at a bad angle, or a man who'd been awake 19 hours straight, starting to see things that weren't there. He'd say as much, flat out, and the drivers who knew him had learned not to bring it up if they wanted a quiet run. That particular evening, he was running a load of feeder cattle off a ranch outside Great Bend, headed down 56, toward a feed yard past Kinsley. Maybe 40 minutes of highway, if the crossing stayed clear. Early June, the wheat standing thick and gold on both sides of the road, combined still crawling through a few fields under their own headlights, because some outfits liked to cut into the cool of the evening, when the moisture came back into the straw. The sky was doing that long Kansas fade, the sun already down but the light hanging on low and orange in the west, heat lightning flickering soundless way off. To the south, where it wasn't going to amount to anything, dust hung in the air from the day's cutting, thick enough that it caught the last of the light and turned the whole horizon the color of a fresh bruise. 20 minutes into the drive, another voice had come up on the CB, a hauler he half recognized running produce out toward Larned, talking about lights he'd seen out past Great Bend a few nights back, low over a milo field, no sound to them at all. Dale had keyed up just long enough to tell him it was probably ag pilots doing a night spray run or somebody's drone getting fancy, and then he'd turn the volume down and let the radio go quiet. He didn't think about it again. He had a load to get down the road and a receiving window to make before the yard closed up for the night. For a while, the drive was nothing. Cattle shift their weight in a trailer. They bawl now and then. They find their footing when the truck takes a curve. And after 15 years, that noise is just part of the engine to a man like Dale. Background he doesn't hear anymore, any more than he hears his own tires on the pavement. The load behind him was settled, quiet in the way cattle get once they've figured out the ride, and decided there's nothing to do but stand it out. Then, somewhere around mile marker 214, the noise changed. Not one animal getting spooked and setting off its neighbors the way it sometimes goes, but the whole trailer shifting at once. a restlessness that rippled front to back, like a current running through water. Hooves started finding a rhythm against the decking, uneven at first, then not. Dale's first thought was weather, pure reflex after 15 years, but he checked the sky out of habit, and there was nothing to see. No wall cloud, no green cast to the light, nothing but that far-off heat lightning that had been flickering harmlessly the whole drive. Whatever had gotten into them, it wasn't coming from the sky in any way he recognized. He ran the checklist next, because that's what you do. He watched his mirrors for a tire starting to shred, felt for any pull in the steering that would mean a bearing going bad, glanced at his gauges for anything creeping into the red. Everything read normal. The trailer was tracking straight and true behind him. Nothing dragging, nothing loose, nothing that would explain 6,000 pounds of animal, deciding all at once that something was wrong. The AM station he'd had on low for the crop report started breaking up right about then. Hash and static swallowing the announcer's voice mid-sentence, then clearing, then dropping out again for good. He reached over and thumbed it off without much thought, chalking it up to a dead patch, the kind of thing that happens out where the signal has 40 miles of empty ground to cross before it reaches you. He noticed his phone, mounted on the dash for the GPS, had frozen on its little blue dot, not moving, though the truck plainly was. He scanned the field on his right without really deciding to. The same reflex that has a driver checking his mirrors, looking for the header lights of a combine or a grain cart, something with an engine that might account for the racket behind him. And that's when he saw it. A single light, low over the wheat stubble, moving parallel to the road, maybe a quarter-mile out. No blink to it, no red and green running lights, no strobe, just a steady light, moving fast and level, and dead silent, even with his window cracked, and the cattle noise falling for half a second between waves. His mind went straight to combine, the obvious answer. One headlamp burned out on a rig somebody was running late into the night. But there was no dust rising behind it, the way there is behind anything moving that fast over dry stubble. No rumble of a diesel engine underneath the sound of his own cattle. And the thing was moving too high and too smooth to be riding on a header. He thought drone next, somebody out scouting the crop after dark, and that held for about 2 seconds before he clocked the size of it against the field, the distance it was covering, and understood nothing store-bought was doing that. He kept his eyes on it, foot easing off the gas without him quite telling it to, and watched the light change direction. Not a bank, not the slow curve a plane makes, or even the jerky little corrections of a drone finding its bearings. It simply stopped going one way and started going another, the way you'd expect if somebody yanked it sideways on a wire, except there was no arc to the motion at all, no give. That was the moment something cold moved through Dale's chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Behind him, the cattle went from restless to something else entirely, a full, violent panic, animals slamming shoulder to shoulder into the aluminum siding, hard enough that he felt it transmit up through the fifth wheel and into his own seat. He'd hauled through hailstorms that didn't produce this. He'd hauled through a tornado warning outside Salina years back, sky the color of a day-old bruise, and even that load hadn't thrown itself against the walls like this one was doing now. He started doing the math a hauler does in that moment without wanting to. Weight distribution, trailer rating, how much abuse aluminum can take before it gives, and none of the numbers he came up with made him feel better. He made the call to pull over, hazards on, easing what rig and trailer he had onto a shoulder that wasn't built for much more than a flat tire, gravel popping under the tires, mindful the whole time that harvest season put grain trucks on this road at every hour, and a stopped semi in the dark was its own kind of danger. He sat there with the engine idling and the trailer still rocking behind him and thought, for just a second, about keying the CB, and then didn't, picturing exactly how it would sound, and exactly who'd be listening, and exactly what they'd say for the next 6 months about the man who never had time for that talk on Channel 19. The light didn't drift off into the distance the way he half expected, half hoped. It came toward the road instead, crossing directly in front of his windshield, level with where his own eyes sat in the cab, close enough that for one full second, it filled his view the way an oncoming headlight does, right before you flinch. It wasn't a shape so much as a light, without anything you could point to as its source. No visible edge to it, no housing, no beam spreading out the way a headlamp's does. And it made no sound at all, which was somehow the part that stayed with him longest, because something that size moving that close should have made some kind of noise, wind displaced, anything, and there was nothing, just the sound of his own cattle screaming behind him, and his own heart going in his ears. Then it cleared the ditch on the far side, and the wheat swallowed it again, and the instant it did, the screaming stopped. Not a tapering off the way you'd expect fear to settle, but a full stop, all at once, like a switch had been thrown somewhere down the length of the trailer. The quiet that came after sat on him heavier than the noise had. 15 years of hauling had taught him what settled cattle sound like, the small shuffles, the occasional low bawl, and this wasn't that. This was nothing. Total, unified nothing, from 30-some animals that had been trying to tear a hole in his trailer 30 seconds earlier. He became aware, sitting there, that the hair on his arms was standing up, and that the windshield had fogged in a strange, uneven way, clearing from the center out, rather than the edges, in the way a windshield normally does when the defrost kicks on. He glanced at his phone, still frozen on that blue dot, and when it finally caught back up to itself, the timestamp on it didn't match his dash clock by almost 4 minutes. A gap he wouldn't think much about again, until he pulled his log later that week and found the same 4 minutes missing, a jump his electronic log couldn't account for, and neither could he. He sat there a minute longer with both hands still on the wheel, and admitted to himself, privately, in a way he never would out loud, that he was shaking. He keyed the CB anyway. His voice wasn't as steady as he wanted it to be when he gave his handle and his mile marker and said a light had just crossed the road in front of him, and his cattle had gone off like nothing he'd ever hauled through, and then dropped dead silent the second it was gone, and he didn't have a word for what he'd just watched. He braced for the ribbing. What came back instead was a pause, a few seconds of open air, and then a different voice, low and even, said he wasn't the first one to call something like that in that night. Said a produce hauler running west on the same highway had radioed almost the identical thing not 20 minutes earlier. A different mile marker, 10 or 12 miles up the road, same description, same silence after. Dale sat with that for longer than he meant to before he answered back. It was one thing to explain away what his own tired eyes had shown him at the end of a long day. It was another thing entirely to hear a stranger, on a different stretch of the same highway, describe the same light, doing the same thing, at almost the same hour. A man who had no way of knowing what Dale had just seen, and no reason to make it match. He got the truck moving again eventually, because freight doesn't wait, and neither does a receiving window, and he drove the rest of the way into the yard, checking his mirrors more than the job required, watching the fields on both sides, longer than made sense for a man who didn't believe in anything. At the yard, backing up to the chute, the hand working receiving that night, a wiry older guy named Gary Weathers, who'd been penning cattle at that facility longer than Dale had been driving, noticed the animals coming off wrong. Wide-eyed, reluctant, bunching up at the gate, instead of moving through it, the way a settled load usually does. Weathers asked if Dale had run into weather on the way down, and when Dale said no, just clear skies the whole route, Weathers went quiet for a second and then said, offhand, like it wasn't much of anything, that this made the second load that month that had come in, acting spooked with no storm and no accident to explain it. A load out of a different county, different driver, a few weeks back, same wide-eyed refusal to settle. Weathers hadn't thought much of it at the time. Cattle spook, that's what they do. But 2 in a month, both with nothing behind them to account for it, had stuck with him enough to mention it. Dale drove home that night running the whole thing over, and not liking how little of it he could explain away. The cattle didn't come out of it in a day. 2 full days after they'd been unloaded, they still wouldn't lie down. still weren't eating the way settled cattle do, standing bunched at the far end of their pen, with that same wide-eyed look Weathers had noticed at the chute. The feed yard's vet, a woman named Pauline Ostrander, who'd been doctoring cattle in that part of the state for better than 20 years, drove out to check them, ran through fever, injury, anything physical that might explain the behavior, and came up with nothing. No temperature, no lameness, no sign of anything a vet knows how to treat. She stood at the pen fence a while, just watching them, the way a person does when the animal in front of them isn't giving up an answer, and then she mentioned, almost to herself, that she'd seen this exact thing, this same refusal to bed down, in another set of cattle out of another hauler a few weeks back, and she hadn't had an explanation for that one either. It didn't end there. Not clean and not tidy, the way a person might want it to. Word gets around in a farming county faster than most people outside one would believe, and it wasn't long before Dale heard, secondhand through a cousin who did dispatch work for the sheriff's office 2 counties over, that the radar station out past Dodge City had logged an unexplained return that same night. Low altitude, no transponder, gone, before anybody had reason or authority to scramble anything to look at it. Nobody made a report out of it. Nobody called anybody official. It got logged and shelved the way these things do out there, filed next to a handful of other returns from that same stretch of ground over the years that nobody had ever bothered chasing down, because chasing them down had never once turned up an answer worth the paperwork. Dale never did start telling the story unprompted. He still wasn't a man who'd say out loud what he thought he'd seen, and if you pushed him on it directly, he'd still tell you he didn't know what it was and wasn't going to guess. But he stopped arguing with the drivers, who did want to talk about it on Channel 19. He'd let the conversation run now, listening more than he used to, and every single time he ran that stretch of 56 past mile marker 214, his eyes went to the wheat on either side of the road a beat longer than they used to, waiting on something he couldn't name, and hoping, in a way he'd never have admitted before that June, that he wouldn't see it again. Somewhere in his glove box, tucked under the registration, there was a scrap of paper now with a date and a mile marker written on it in his own hand, and nothing else, just sitting there, waiting to see if he'd ever need to add a second line beneath the first.